Every night, something remarkable happens. You close your eyes, the room grows quieter, the conversations of the day slowly fade into the background. Your body begins to settle, your breathing softens, and for a few hours it seems as though the world has finally stopped asking anything of you. It feels like everything inside you is resting, but it isn't. While your body sleeps, your brain remains astonishingly alive. Beneath the silence, billions of neurons continue communicating with one another. Electrical activity moves across different regions of the brain. Memories are sorted. Recent experiences are woven together with older ones. Emotions that never found enough space during the day continue to unfold in the background. In other words, sleep is not the absence of mental activity. It's simply a different kind of activity. For many years, people imagined sleep as if someone had switched off the lights inside the mind. You worked all day, your brain powered down for the night, and in the morning, everything started again. Modern neuroscience paints a very different picture. The brain never truly turns off. If it did, that wouldn't be sleep. It would be a medical emergency. Instead, different networks become more or less active depending on whether we're awake or asleep. While your body is recovering, your mind is still remarkably busy, carrying on work that only it can do. And one of the most fascinating parts of that work is dreaming. Whether you remember your dreams or not, your brain continues producing them throughout the night. Studies that monitor electrical brain activity show that people who say, "I never dream," display the same patterns of dreaming as those who remember vivid dreams every morning. The difference often isn't whether the dream happened, it's whether the dream stayed with you long enough to be remembered. That realization quietly changes something, diminishes. Because if dreaming is something every healthy human brain naturally does, then perhaps dreams aren't strange interruptions to sleep. Perhaps they're part of what sleep is for. We spend nearly a third of our lives asleep. Most of us think of that time as empty, a necessary pause between one busy day and the next. But what if that entire portion of life has been quietly misunderstood? What if those hours are not empty at all? What if they're another way your mind continues caring for you? Not by solving tomorrow's schedule, not by organizing your inbox, not by helping you answer emails or finish unfinished work, but by processing experiences in a language that feels less logical and far more emotional. That's why dreams can feel so unusual. A childhood home suddenly appears beside your current workplace. Someone you haven't seen in 20 years sits across from you as though no time has passed. You find yourself flying, or falling, or searching endlessly for something you can't even name. None of it follows ordinary logic. Yet while you're inside the dream, every emotion feels completely real. For centuries, people have tried to explain this. Some believed dreams were messages from somewhere beyond ourselves. Others dismissed them as meaningless noise created by a sleeping brain. Today's science suggests a more grounded possibility. Dreams may be neither supernatural messages nor random static. Instead, they may be one of the ways the brain continues processing our lives, using images, memories, emotions, and imagination rather than words and logic. That doesn't mean every dream contains a hidden answer. It doesn't mean every symbol has one universal meaning. A dream about water doesn't automatically represent emotion. A dream about flying doesn't automatically represent freedom, and a dream about losing your teeth doesn't necessarily carry the same meaning for everyone who experiences it. Perhaps the greatest mistake we make is believing every dream must be solved like a puzzle. Sometimes there is no puzzle. Sometimes there is only an experience worth noticing. Instead of asking, "What does this dream mean?" perhaps a gentler question is, "Why did this feeling stay with me?" Because when we wake up, most dreams disappear almost immediately, yet every so often one leaves behind something that lingers, a strange sense of peace, a quiet sadness, an unexplained feeling of relief, a fear that seems larger than the dream itself. Maybe those lingering emotions deserve our attention more than the dream's storyline ever could. Not because they predict the future, not because they reveal secret truths, but because they offer another perspective on the same life we're already living. During the day, we're busy making decisions, solving problems, and moving from one responsibility to the next. At night, the mind continues the conversation without deadlines, without schedules, and without needing everything to make perfect sense. And perhaps that's where its quiet value lies. Not in giving us answers, but in showing us another way of seeing ourselves. So before we spend this time together exploring nightmares, dream recall, lucid dreaming, and what modern neuroscience has discovered about our sleeping minds, it may help to begin with one simple shift. Maybe the most interesting question isn't, what did my dream mean? Maybe it's, why did my mind choose that emotion? That quiet question is where our journey begins. Have you ever woken up from a dream and thought, that made absolutely no sense? Maybe you were having dinner with someone who passed ago. Maybe you walked through your childhood home and somehow ended up at your current workplace without ever noticing the transition. Maybe you were running from something you couldn't see, or flying without questioning how it was possible. Dreams rarely obey the rules we expect from everyday life. Time bends, places merge, people appear and disappear without explanation. And yet, while we're inside the dream, almost none of it feels strange. We simply accept it. For a long time, scientists wondered why dreams were so different from our waking experiences. If the brain is the same brain, why does it seem to create such an unfamiliar world every night? Part of the answer lies in the fact that the brain doesn't operate in exactly the same way while we're asleep. Think of your mind as a large city. During the day, one district is especially busy. It's the part responsible for planning your schedule, solving problems, making decisions, staying organized, and helping you navigate daily life. You might think of it as the brain's executive office, the quiet manager constantly deciding what deserves your attention next. Without it, everyday life would quickly become overwhelming. It's what helps you drive safely through traffic, remember appointments, finish conversations, and make practical choices from morning until night. But when you fall asleep, that balance begins to shift. The executive systems don't disappear, they simply become less dominant. At the same time, other networks become more active. The systems involved in imagination begin making connections that wouldn't normally happen during the day. The emotional centers of the brain become more engaged. Memories are revisited, reorganized, and blended together. It's almost as if the careful editor leaves the room for a while, allowing the storytellers, artists, and emotional historians inside your mind to continue the conversation. That may explain why dreams often feel emotionally vivid even when they make very little logical sense. You may not remember every detail of a dream, but you often remember how it felt. A conversation that never actually happened can leave you feeling comforted for hours. A place that doesn't exist can somehow feel deeply familiar. A dream lasting only a few minutes can leave behind a lingering sadness that follows you through the morning. Emotion remains surprisingly consistent, even when the story itself is impossible. That's one of the reasons researchers believe dreams shouldn't always be judged by their plot. The storyline may be chaotic, but the emotional experience is often surprisingly coherent. This is also why searching for perfect interpretations can become frustrating. Our waking minds naturally want everything to fit into neat categories. We want one symbol to equal one meaning. We want certainty. But the dreaming brain isn't trying to write a report. It's exploring possibilities. It connects ideas loosely rather than logically. It moves through memory by association rather than chronology. And sometimes, those unusual connections allow us to notice things we might otherwise overlook. Not predictions, not hidden prophecies, simply different perspectives. Imagine looking through two different camera lenses. The landscape hasn't changed, only the way you see it has. Your waking mind views life through clarity, structure, efficiency, and control. Your dreaming mind views that same life through imagination, memory, symbolism, and emotion. Neither perspective is complete on its own, and neither is necessarily more truthful than the other. They're simply different ways of understanding the same experiences. This shift in perspective also explains something many people find reassuring. You don't become another person when you dream. You remain yourself. The same memories, the same relationships, the same hopes, the same fears. Your brain is simply emphasizing different parts of your inner world while temporarily quieting the systems that usually keep everything organized. Perhaps that's why dreams sometimes surprise us, not because they reveal someone we've never been, but because they allow us to notice parts of ourselves that are usually drowned out by the constant demands of everyday life. When we begin to see dreams this way, they become a little less mysterious. Not because we've explained everything, but because we've stopped expecting them to behave like ordinary thoughts. They aren't ordinary thoughts. They're ordinary human experiences, seen through an extraordinary lens. And once we understand that, another question naturally appears. If the dreaming mind speaks in images and emotions instead of clear explanations, how do we know which dreams are actually worth paying attention to? If you've ever searched the internet after a vivid dream, you're not alone. Perhaps you typed something like, "What does it mean if I dream about falling?" Or, "Why did I dream that my teeth fell out?" Within seconds, you'll find hundreds of interpretations. One website tells you it's about anxiety, another says it's a sign of personal transformation, a third insists it's a warning about something that's about to happen. The problem isn't that these explanations are comforting. The problem is that they often sound far more certain than the science actually is. One of the most refreshing ideas from modern dream research is also one of the simplest. Not every dream is trying to tell you something profound. That may feel almost disappointing at first. We naturally want our dreams to fit together like pieces of a puzzle. We want one clear symbol to lead to one clear answer. But our minds don't always work that way. Some dreams are simply echoes of the day you've just lived. If you've been worried about giving a presentation tomorrow, it's not surprising to dream about showing up unprepared. If you've been overwhelmed at work, your mind may continue rehearsing those emotions while you sleep. These dreams don't necessarily require interpretation. They may simply reflect experiences that are already close to the surface. Other dreams feel even more random. People appear who have nothing to do with one another. Places blend together. Conversations begin in one city and somehow end in another. Sometimes your brain is simply making loose associations between memories without trying to build a meaningful story. Trying to decode every detail can become exhausting. In fact, it may cause us to miss what matters most. Because according to the neuroscientist we explored earlier, the dreams most worth reflecting on are usually not the strangest ones. They're the ones that leave behind two things: a strong emotion and a clear central image. Not necessarily because those images carry universal meanings, but because they continue to stay with you after you've opened your eyes. Think about the difference. Most dreams disappear within moments of waking. You might remember fragments for a few seconds before they dissolve completely. But every so often, one refuses to leave. Perhaps you keep thinking about a single doorway, a child standing silently across a room, an empty train station, an endless staircase. Or perhaps you remember almost nothing except one overwhelming feeling: relief, grief, shame, wonder, peace. Those lingering emotions may be far more interesting than the dream's storyline itself, because emotions often reveal what our attention has overlooked. Not hidden truths, not predictions, simply experiences that may still be asking to be acknowledged. This is where dreams become less like riddles and more like mirrors. A mirror doesn't tell you who you are. It simply reflects something you might otherwise fail to notice. Dreams may work in a similar way. They don't hand us answers, they offer another angle, another perspective, another chance to become curious about ourselves. One example shared by the neuroscientist involves military veterans. Some veterans who had long since returned from war found that during periods of major emotional stress, such as going through a divorce, their old war dreams suddenly returned. The dream wasn't necessarily about the war anymore. The war had become the emotional language the brain used to express a completely different struggle. the same emotional intensity, a different life circumstance. Another example came from his own experience. During a particularly difficult relationship, he repeatedly dreamed of riding inside an elevator that kept dropping. The dream never announced, "This relationship is unhealthy." It never explained itself. It simply returned to the same emotional experience over and over again. As the relationship gradually became healthier, the falling sensation quietly disappeared. The dream didn't solve the problem, it reflected the emotional climate surrounding it. Perhaps that's why searching for the single, correct interpretation often leads us in the wrong direction. The value isn't in translating every symbol, the value is in asking gentle questions. Why did that feeling stay with me? Does this emotion remind me of something happening in my life right now? What part of myself have I been too busy to notice? Notice how different these questions feel. They're not trying to force certainty, they're inviting reflection. And reflection rarely happens when we're rushing to find the right answer. Sometimes the most meaningful response to a dream isn't interpretation at all. Sometimes it's simply sitting quietly for a few minutes, allowing the feeling to exist, and becoming curious enough to wonder what it might be connected to. Because perhaps dreams were never designed to explain our lives. Perhaps they simply help us look at them from another direction. And if that's true, then there is one kind of dream that deserves a little more attention than the rest. Not because it predicts the future, but because it refuses to let us sleep peacefully. Nightmares. Most of us use the words bad dream and nightmare as if they mean the same thing. But according to sleep researchers, they aren't. A bad dream may leave you feeling uncomfortable. A nightmare does something more. It frightens you so intensely that it wakes you up. Your heart is racing, your breathing has changed. For a few moments, your body reacts as though the danger was real, even after you've opened your eyes. Almost everyone experiences nightmares at some point in life. Children often begin having them around the ages of 4, 5, or 6. They appear even in safe, loving homes, suggesting that nightmares are a normal part of development rather than a sign that something is wrong. For most children, they gradually become less frequent. Adults are different. An occasional nightmare is simply part of being human. But when nightmares begin appearing repeatedly, especially if they seem to come out of nowhere, they may deserve a little more attention. Not panic, not self-diagnosis, simply attention. This is one of the places where dream research becomes surprisingly practical. The neuroscientist whose work we've been exploring explains that recurring nightmares can sometimes act like an early signal that our emotional well-being deserves another look. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, nightmares predict disaster. He doesn't say they reveal hidden prophecies, and he certainly doesn't suggest that every frightening dream means you have a mental health disorder. Instead, he compares recurring nightmares to something much more ordinary. A headache. Pain itself isn't the illness, but it may be your body's way of saying, please slow down and notice what's happening. Perhaps nightmares can serve a similar purpose. During the day, many of us become remarkably skilled at functioning. We meet deadlines, we take care of other people, we smile through difficult conversations. We tell ourselves, I'm fine. Sometimes we even believe it. Then, during the night, something changes. The part of the brain responsible for staying productive becomes quieter. Emotions have more room to surface. Experiences we've been pushing aside may continue processing without our conscious effort. That's one reason recurring nightmares can sometimes surprise people who appear to be coping well on the outside. The daytime version of themselves keeps moving. The nighttime version quietly asks whether everything is truly okay. Again, that doesn't mean every nightmare has deep psychological meaning. Sometimes it's simply the result of stress. Sometimes it's influenced by medication, illness, or disrupted sleep. Sometimes there is no obvious explanation at all. Science doesn't claim to have every answer, and perhaps that's an important reminder in itself. Curiosity is more useful than certainty. There is another situation where nightmares become especially important: trauma. People living with post-traumatic stress disorder, often called PTSD, may experience recurring nightmares that replay terrifying experiences or recreate the emotional intensity surrounding them. In these cases, dreams are not simply symbolic. They can become part of how trauma continues affecting daily life. This is why nightmares deserve compassion rather than judgment. They're not a sign of weakness. They're not evidence that someone has failed to move on. They're part of the complex ways the brain continues processing experiences that were too overwhelming to fully integrate when they first happened. Perhaps the most hopeful part of this research is that even nightmares are not always fixed. One treatment for recurring nightmares has a remarkably gentle approach. Instead of trying to suppress the dream, people are invited to rewrite it. Before going to sleep, they spend a few minutes imagining the same nightmare, but with a different ending. The person escapes safely. Someone arrives to help. The frightening scene gradually changes. The danger passes. This practice is known as imagery rehearsal therapy. At first, it sounds almost too simple. How could changing an imaginary story influence a recurring nightmare? Researchers believe the answer may lie in one of the brain's greatest strengths. Human beings naturally understand life through stories. The stories we tell ourselves shape how we experience fear, hope, loss, and recovery. By gently introducing a new ending before sleep, we're not pretending the difficult experience never happened. We're simply allowing the mind to practice another possibility, another emotional pathway, another way through the same darkness. There's something quietly reassuring about that. Healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it begins with imagination. Sometimes it begins with giving ourselves permission to picture safety where our minds have only remembered danger. And perhaps that offers a wider lesson beyond nightmares themselves. When life feels overwhelming, we often assume we need bigger solutions. More certainty, more control, more answers. Yet sometimes the first step is much smaller. To pause, to notice, to ask ourselves whether we've been carrying more than we realized. Nightmares may not be trying to frighten us. Perhaps, in their own uncomfortable way, they're trying to get our attention. Not so we'll fear the night, but so we'll care a little more gently for ourselves during the day. And if dreams can sometimes become quiet reflections of our emotional world, perhaps there are also small ways we can begin working with them instead of simply waking up and forgetting them. By now, you might be wondering something very practical. If dreams can sometimes offer a different perspective on our emotional lives, how do we actually become more aware of them? The answer, surprisingly, isn't to become better at interpreting dreams. It's to become better at creating a little space around them. For many of us, the first and last moments of the day have become remarkably crowded. At night, we scroll until our eyes grow heavy. In the morning, an alarm sounds, and within seconds, we're checking messages, reading headlines, answering emails, or thinking about everything waiting for us. The day begins before we've had a chance to notice ourselves. Some sleep researchers suggest that this transition may matter more than we realize, not because these few minutes are magical, but because they sit between two different ways of thinking. As you fall asleep, your logical mind gradually loosens its grip. As you wake up, it slowly returns. Those brief moments in between create a unique window where thoughts, emotions, and images can still drift between both worlds. Rather than rushing through them, what if we simply stayed there for a little while? The practice begins the night before. Not with complicated techniques, not with expensive equipment, just a small change in attention. Before closing your eyes, put your phone aside if you can. Allow yourself a few quiet minutes without new information entering your mind. Instead of asking yourself to solve tomorrow's problems, try offering your mind a gentle question instead. It could be something simple. How am I really feeling about this decision? What do I need to understand about this relationship? What have I been avoiding lately? Notice the difference. You're not demanding an answer. You're not expecting a dream to solve your life. You're simply inviting your mind to keep exploring while you rest. The neuroscientist describes this as a form of suggestion, a quiet intention. Not a command, just a direction. Then let sleep do what sleep naturally does. The second part happens after you wake up. This may be the more difficult habit. Most mornings, we move almost immediately. We reach for the phone, we check the time, we begin planning the day before we've even taken a full breath. Instead, imagine doing almost nothing for the first few minutes. Stay still. Don't rush to sit up. Don't immediately fill your attention with the outside world. Simply notice. Is there an image still floating in your mind? A conversation? A color? A place? Perhaps there isn't. Perhaps all that's left is a feeling. Curiosity, sadness, calm, anxiety, or maybe nothing at all. That's perfectly okay. This practice isn't about forcing dream recall. In fact, one of the most helpful ideas from today's conversation is that remembering dreams doesn't always mean replaying an entire story. Sometimes what remains isn't a dream, it's simply a different quality of thinking. Many creative people have described having unexpected ideas during these first few minutes after waking. Not because a dream handed them a solution, but because their minds were still moving in a more open, associative way. The neuroscientist himself says many of his ideas arrive during this window. When he wakes, he doesn't immediately begin the day. Instead, he stays with those thoughts for a few moments before writing down whatever remains. Not because every thought is brilliant, but because some of them would disappear forever if he hurried past them. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. You wake with the feeling that you just had an important insight. For a brief moment, it feels perfectly clear. Then, within seconds, it's gone. Like trying to hold water in your hands, or watching words dissolve before you have time to read them. Most of us simply continue with the day. Maybe that's understandable, but perhaps we've been leaving something valuable behind. Not secret knowledge, not mystical messages, just a quieter version of our own thinking. If you'd like, keep a notebook beside your bed, not to analyze every dream, not to search for hidden symbols, simply to capture a few words before they disappear. Sometimes you'll write almost nothing. Other mornings, one sentence may stay with you all day. Over time, the practice becomes less about remembering dreams and more about remembering yourself. Because these 5 quiet minutes do something our busy lives rarely encourage. They remind us that before the world begins asking for our attention, our own inner life deserves a little attention too. And once we begin slowing down enough to notice these quieter moments, another fascinating possibility begins to emerge. Some people don't simply remember their dreams. Occasionally, they become aware that they're dreaming while the dream is still happening. There is one part of dreaming that almost sounds too strange to be true. Imagine you're in the middle of a dream. Maybe you're walking through an unfamiliar city. Maybe you're talking to someone who couldn't possibly be there. Everything feels completely real. And then, without waking up, a thought quietly appears. Wait, I'm dreaming. Not after the dream, not once you open your eyes, while the dream is still happening. This experience is called lucid dreaming, and despite sounding like science fiction, it has been studied in sleep laboratories for decades. Researchers have found that during lucid dreaming, a person remains asleep according to brain activity, yet becomes aware that the experience unfolding around them isn't waking reality. In some cases, they can even influence what happens next. For many years, people dismissed these stories as impossible, but scientists eventually discovered a clever way to test them. Patients who claimed they could lucid dream were connected to equipment that monitored their brain activity during sleep. Because the muscles of the body remain largely inactive during REM sleep, researchers asked them to communicate using only one movement they could still control: their eyes. Before falling asleep, they agreed on a specific pattern of eye movements. Once the dreamer realized they were dreaming, they performed that exact pattern from inside the dream. The signal appeared on the recording equipment. It was one of the first convincing demonstrations that a person could be asleep, dreaming, and consciously aware at the same time. It's an extraordinary finding, not because everyone needs to learn lucid dreaming, but because it reminds us that consciousness isn't simply on or off. It exists on a spectrum, and sleep is far more complex than we once imagined. Naturally, many people hear about lucid dreaming and immediately wonder whether they should try it. The answer depends on what you're hoping to find. If your goal is to gain control over every dream, you may end up missing something important. Most dreams were never meant to be controlled. They're meant to be experienced. Sometimes the greatest insight arrives precisely because we weren't directing the story. Still, for those who are curious, researchers have identified one simple practice that appears to increase the likelihood of lucid dreaming. The idea isn't to force anything, it's to create the right conditions. The method begins by setting an alarm about 5 or 6 hours after you fall asleep. At that point in the night, dreaming tends to be more vivid, and your brain is already spending more time in REM sleep. When the alarm wakes you, resist the urge to fully wake up. Stay in bed, keep your eyes closed if possible. Allow yourself to remain in that soft, drowsy state between sleeping and waking. Rather than reaching for your phone or getting out of bed, quietly repeat a simple intention. When I fall asleep again, I'll recognize that I'm dreaming. There is no guarantee it will happen that night or the next. Like remembering dreams, lucid dreaming seems to become more likely through gentle repetition rather than effort. What's fascinating is that the practice relies on something surprisingly ordinary: suggestion. The human brain is remarkably responsive to the ideas we carry into sleep. Just as watching a frightening movie before bed can sometimes shape the emotional tone of our dreams, carrying a quiet intention into sleep may influence how awareness appears later in the night. That doesn't mean we can script our dreams. It simply means the boundary between waking thought and dreaming isn't as solid as it feels. Some athletes have experimented with lucid dreaming as a way to mentally rehearse movements. Some artists describe finding creative inspiration there. Others simply enjoy the rare experience of observing their own minds from the inside. But perhaps the most meaningful lesson has nothing to do with lucid dreaming itself. It's this: your sleeping mind isn't separate from you. It isn't an alternate version of yourself living a mysterious life after dark. It's still you. The same memories, the same emotions, the same hopes, the same unfinished questions. Only now they're being explored without the constant pressure of schedules, responsibilities, and logical thinking. And maybe that's enough. Maybe you don't need to control your dreams at all. Maybe it's enough to know that every night your mind continues working on your life in ways you rarely notice. Quietly, patiently, without asking for recognition. Because sometimes the greatest mystery isn't whether we can wake up inside a dream. It's realizing that a part of us has been quietly awake all along. After everything we've explored together, you might expect this conversation to end with a simple answer: that dreams predict the future, or that every symbol has a hidden meaning waiting to be decoded, or that if you learn the right technique, you'll finally understand every strange story your mind creates at night. But perhaps the most honest conclusion is much quieter than that. Dreams don't always give us answers. Sometimes they simply remind us to ask better questions. The neuroscientist we learned from today never suggests that every dream carries a secret message. In fact, he repeatedly cautions against trying to force meaning onto experiences that may simply reflect an ordinary day. Instead, he offers something far more practical. Dreams can become another way of paying attention to ourselves, not because they're magical, because they're personal. Your dreams are built from your memories, your emotions, your imagination, your experiences. No one else has lived exactly the life you have lived, which means no one else will dream exactly the dreams you dream. That alone makes them worth approaching with curiosity rather than certainty. Perhaps that's why so many of us wake up and immediately reach for the outside world: the phone, the news, messages, schedules, responsibilities. Within seconds, our attention belongs to everyone except ourselves. The quiet bridge between sleeping and waking disappears before we even notice it existed. Yet those first few minutes may be one of the only times each day when nothing is demanding an answer from us. No notifications, no expectations, no performance. just a mind slowly returning from a place where imagination spoke more loudly than logic. Whether you remember a dream or not almost becomes secondary. The real practice is learning not to rush away from yourself. 5 quiet minutes, lying still, not trying to interpret everything, simply noticing. What feeling is still here? What image refuses to disappear? What thought seems unusually gentle? Sometimes there will be nothing. Sometimes there will be only a vague emotion you can't explain. Sometimes there will be a single sentence that arrives without effort. None of these moments need to become profound, but together, over weeks and months, they begin teaching something that modern life rarely encourages. How to listen before reacting, how to observe before judging, how to become familiar with your own inner world. Many of us spend years searching for clarity by collecting more information, reading another book, listening to another podcast, watching another video, waiting for someone wiser to explain our lives to us. Yet every single night, your own mind has already been quietly reflecting on your experiences. Not perfectly, not infallibly, but honestly. And maybe that's enough. Because self-awareness isn't built through one dramatic breakthrough. It's usually built through hundreds of small moments when we choose to notice instead of ignore. A feeling, a question, a pattern, a pause. Those tiny moments rarely look important while they're happening, but over time, they gently reshape how we understand ourselves. Perhaps that's why dreams have fascinated human beings for thousands of years, not because they solve every mystery, but because they remind us that there is always more happening beneath the surface than we can see during the rush of everyday life. So tonight, before you fall asleep, you don't have to search for hidden symbols. You don't have to force yourself to remember every dream. You don't have to become a lucid dreamer. Instead, you might try something much simpler. As you close your eyes, bring one gentle question with you. Not a problem you need to solve tonight, just a question you're willing to live beside for a while. And tomorrow morning, if a feeling, an image, or even a quiet thought lingers for a few moments before the day begins, resist the urge to rush past it. Stay there, just a little longer. Because perhaps the greatest gift isn't the dream itself. Perhaps it's discovering that, beneath all the noise of everyday life, there has always been a quieter conversation waiting for your attention. And sometimes, those quiet conversations change us far more than the loud ones ever could.